If you've ever wondered how thin the line was between freedom and bondage in the American West, you need only stand in the center of that dusty street. It was high noon in a frontier town that barely deserved its name, a scatter of wooden buildings nailed together against wind and hope, the kind of place where the saloon doors never quite closed, and the law came second to whoever held the loudest voice or the fullest purse. Dust clung to everything: boots, window ledges, eyelashes. And that day, it clung to her. She stood on a small wooden platform outside the general store, wrists loosely bound with rope more for show than necessity. She was a Chinese widow, perhaps no more than 25. No grief had carved quiet lines into her face. Her husband had died laying railroad track through unforgiving desert land, one of thousands of immigrant laborers who built the veins of a growing nation but were seldom welcomed into its heart. When he died, so did her protection. In many frontier territories, immigrant workers signed contracts they barely understood. Debt followed them like a shadow, for travel, food, tools, even burial costs. Without a husband to settle accounts, she became the balance unpaid. The town ledger did not see her as a grieving woman. It saw her as an asset. The auctioneer wiped sweat from his neck and announced her skills as if describing livestock. Good with herbs, laundry, cooking, small, quiet. Won't cause trouble. The crowd murmured. Some came out of curiosity. Others came to purchase cheap labor. A few men leaned against posts with expressions that made it clear they expected more than cooking and washing. For many Chinese women in the West, survival meant invisibility. Anti-immigrant laws and prejudice had pushed them into the narrowest corners of society. Without family or community protection, widows were especially vulnerable. They could be forced into labor contracts, domestic servitude, or worse, all under the appearance of legality. She did not cry. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Her dark eyes scanned the crowd, not pleading, not defiant, simply measuring. She had learned in railroad camps that survival depended on watching closely and speaking little. Panic fed predators. Silence preserved strength. A rancher bid first, low. Laughter followed. Another man raised the price slightly, calculating what a year of hard labor might yield. The auctioneer nodded eagerly. Coins clinked in a leather pouch. And then the crowd shifted. He did not look like the others. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair tied back and eyes steady as mountain stone, the Apache stood at the edge of the gathering. He wore no badge, no ranch brand, no sign of allegiance to the town. The frontier had pushed his people from their lands, confined them, hunted them, labeled them enemies. Yet here he stood, quiet, observant. He had come into town for supplies, nothing more. But he had seen auctions before. He knew the smell of them, the mix of sweat, greed, and resignation. When the bidding stalled, he stepped forward. The amount he offered was enough to silence the laughter. Not extravagant, but decisive. The kind of sum that ended argument. The auctioneer blinked. "You sure?" he asked, glancing uneasily at the crowd. The Apache nodded once. Money changed hands. The rope around her wrists was untied and handed. Symbolically, to him. In that moment, the town believed it understood the story. A man had paid. A woman had been purchased. The transaction was complete, but as he turned to leave, something unexpected happened. Instead of gripping her arm, instead of issuing orders, he handed her the loose end of the rope. And with a small knife from his belt, he sliced it clean in two. Gasps rose from the onlookers. She stared at him, confusion flickering across her face for the first time. In the camps, in the kitchens, in the back rooms of hostile towns, payment always meant ownership. There was always a demand waiting to follow. He did not speak immediately. He simply stepped away from the platform and began walking toward the edge of town. After a moment's hesitation, and with nowhere else to go, she followed. Behind them, the crowd muttered. Some scoffed. Some shrugged. The law did not interfere. Money had been exchanged fairly. Whatever happened next was no concern of theirs. But as they reached the quiet stretch beyond the last wooden building, the widow finally found her voice. "You paid," she said softly, the words shaped by careful English. "Now, what you want?" He stopped. For a long second, only wind answered. Then he looked at her, not at her hands, not at her body, but at her face. "I paid," he said slowly, choosing words she would understand. "So you could walk away." In that instant, under the vast western sky, something radical happened. Not ownership, not debt, a chance. They walked in silence at first. The town faded behind them, swallowed by dust and distance, until the noise of bargaining voices and clinking coins became nothing more than a memory carried on the wind. Ahead stretched the open frontier, wide, uncertain, and honest in a way towns rarely were. No auction blocks, no ledgers, no crowds pretending not to see. Still, she kept a careful distance of 3 steps behind him. It was not obedience. It was habit. Years in labor camps and crowded settlements had taught her one unspoken rule: stay just close enough to be under protection, but not close enough to invite attention. Her hands, now free, remained folded in front of her as if the rope were still there. Freedom, she was learning, did not immediately erase fear. The Apache noticed. Without turning, he slowed his pace. She slowed too. He stopped completely. She nearly walked into him before catching herself, stepping back quickly as if expecting correction. Instead, he crouched and drew a line in the dust with a small stick. Then a second line beside it. He pointed to the first line. "Town," he said simply. Then he pointed to the second line. "Road." She watched, puzzled but attentive. He stepped away from both lines and erased them with his hand. The wind carried the dust into the air, scattering the marks until nothing remained. "No rope," he added, his voice calm. "No owner. You walk because you choose." She blinked. The words were simple, but their meaning felt heavy, unfamiliar. In the railroad camps, choice had always been an illusion. Workers chose between hunger or exhaustion, silence or punishment, survival or disappearance. True freedom had been something spoken of in stories, not lived. "You? Not take me?" she asked cautiously. He shook his head once. "I helped you leave." She studied his face, searching for deception. Frontier life had trained her to look for the hidden cost behind every kindness. Food meant labor. Shelter meant obedience. Protection meant loyalty that could not be withdrawn. But his expression remained steady, not demanding, not expectant, just present. They resumed walking, this time side by side, though she still lagged half a step behind out of instinct. The land around them changed gradually as the hours passed. Dry earth gave way to patches of scrub grass. The air smelled of sun-warmed sage and distant rain that had not yet reached the valley. Overhead, hawks circled in slow, patient loops. After some time, she spoke again, her voice softer now. "In camp," she said, choosing words carefully, "men pay for worker. Worker must obey, always." He nodded. He understood more than she realized. In his own life, he had seen treaties signed and broken, land promised and taken, and people forced to obey laws they never agreed to. Different cultures, same pattern, power disguised as order. "Many people in towns," he replied, "believe money makes ownership." She lowered her gaze. "That is truth." He shook his head slightly. "That is belief." not truth. They walked on until the sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in gold and copper. At a small rise overlooking a dry wash, he stopped and gestured toward a shaded area beneath a cluster of mesquite trees. "Rest," he said. She hesitated before sitting, as though waiting for permission that never came. Old instincts again. From a small pouch, he removed a water skin and placed it on the ground between them, not handing it directly, but offering it without hierarchy. She noticed the gesture. In many places she had lived, water was rationed, distributed by rank or favor. Here, it was shared. She drank slowly, respectfully, then bowed her head slightly. "Thank you." After a pause, she reached into the cloth bundle tied at her waist and pulled out a small pouch filled with dried leaves and roots. "Herb," she explained. "Good for heat sickness. My husband learned from old healer near rail camp. He examined the herbs with quiet interest. Indigenous tribes and immigrant workers often developed overlapping survival knowledge, especially in harsh environments where formal medicine was rare. He recognized one of the plants useful for cooling fevers. "You keep this safe?" he asked. She nodded. "Only thing not taken." That sentence carried more weight than it seemed. Possessions of immigrant laborers were often confiscated to cover debts or expenses. Tools, clothes, even personal medicine could vanish into company stores or camp records. The fact that she still had her herbs meant she had protected them fiercely, a small act of resistance in a life shaped by loss. The wind shifted, cooler now. She watched him quietly for a long moment before asking the question that had been growing inside her since they left town. "You? Why help me?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he picked up a small stone and turned it in his hand as if measuring the truth before speaking. "Because," he said at last, "I know what it is to have others decide your worth." Her eyes lifted sharply. The next morning, the sun rose like molten gold over the rugged horizon, spilling warmth across rocky ridges and parched earth. They had camped near a small wash where the water ran only after rain, a hidden place the Apache knew well. The quiet of the landscape contrasted sharply with the chaos of the auction, a reminder that out here, life and death were measured in choices and sills, not coin. The Apache watched her carefully as she stirred the small fire, her hands delicate but precise. He had learned early in life that survival on the frontier required more than strength. It demanded observation, patience, and respect for the land. "You need water?" he asked, his voice low. Calm dot, she nodded, and he gestured toward a nearby depression in the rocks where morning dew had gathered. "Look, see small stones near edge? Water collects. Can drink." She knelt and examined the trickle of moisture, surprised by how little attention she'd paid to such simple clues in her past life. In the railroad camps, water came from barrels or company stores, controlled, rationed, commodified. Here, she was learning to read the land itself. "Also," he said, pointing to tracks in the dirt, "follow trail of coyote or hawk. Animals know water better than men." She repeated the steps, careful, mimicking him. Each action felt strange but empowering. With every lesson, fear loosened its grip a little. Survival was no longer about obedience. It was about understanding. In turn, she began teaching him some of her own knowledge. From her husband's medicine pouch, she produced dried herbs, peppermint leaves, licorice root, and small bundles of lavender. "If fever, crush, boil, drink," she explained. "If burn, make paste, rub. Work in camp, work in town. Helps weak people." He examined each herb, impressed. Native tribes had their own remedies, but these were different, precise, practical, distilled from another continent's traditions and survival needs. "Good," he said. "We'll help travelers who lost way." Their lessons became a quiet rhythm. She learned the land. He learned new medicines. They spoke little, but each exchange carried a deep respect. The Apache showed her how to move quietly across loose rock, how to sense the wind for approaching storms, and how to build a quick shelter from mesquite branches and sage. She showed him how to purify water using natural filters, how to prevent spoilage of dried meat and fruit, and how to create simple poultices for minor wounds. Beyond the skills, something subtler grew. She began to understand the logic behind his quiet vigilance. The frontier was a place where every step mattered. One misread signal, a snapping twig, a shadow at dusk, a missing bird call, could mean danger. And he began to understand her careful patience, the lesson she had learned from suffering, the awareness born of constant threat, the vigilance required to survive in towns that never saw her as human. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she spoke for the first time about the fear that had shadowed her since the auction. "I thought," she said slowly, "all men, if pay money, take control, always, must obey." Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed a small bundle of herbs closer to him. He nodded. "Many think this. Money equals ownership. But it is only belief." She looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of his words. On the frontier, simplicity often carried the weight of truth. She realized then that survival was not just about knowing which plants healed or which rocks marked water. Survival was about learning who could be trusted and, more importantly, who would not demand payment for loyalty or freedom. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night sky. For the first time since the auction, she felt a quiet sense of possibility. Not just escape, not just freedom, but a chance to walk her own path, one lesson at a time, one skill at a time. Alongside a man who had chosen to teach rather than claim. By the time the embers glowed low, the Apache looked over at her and said softly, "Tomorrow we move farther. You watch land. I watch sky. Together, see danger early. Together, survive." She nodded, feeling the strange, growing sense of partnership, not protector and protected, not master and servant, but two outsiders learning to navigate a harsh world together. In the desert, the frontier taught harsh truths, but it also offered rare wisdom. When knowledge is shared, survival becomes more than endurance. It becomes hope. The next morning, the desert air carried a sharper chill, reminding them both that the frontier's beauty often masked its danger. They had found a sheltered canyon to rest, where the sun hit the rocks at an angle that made the place almost private, a rare luxury in a land where eyes and threats were never far. By the fire, she finally spoke the words she had been holding inside since the auction. Her voice was quiet, careful, as if saying them aloud might make them untrue. "I begged you in town," she started, her dark eyes fixed on the glowing embers. "I said, you paid for me? Now do it." The Apache remained silent, watching her carefully, not judging, not interrupting, just listening. "I thought," she continued, "any man who pays, he takes. Always, body, labor, life, always, in camp, in town. Husband die, I alone. So people take what want. I survive, yes. But survive how?" Her words hung heavy in the air, the dust of past towns and harsh winters settling around them. The frontier had given her freedom in one sense. She was no longer bound by rope or debt, but the mental chains of fear and expectation had remained. He shifted slightly, reaching for a small stone and turning it in his hand. "You feared because of what others did," he said softly. "Not because of me." She looked at him, eyes wide with a mixture of relief and surprise. In her experience, men who paid always demanded something in return. Freedom was a trick, a temporary illusion, a debt yet unpaid. "You could have taken me?" she whispered. "Many men. They would have. He shook his head slowly. I do not see you as property. I see you as person. For a moment, the words felt almost unreal. She had been trained to read gestures, to calculate motives, to distrust generosity. Yet here was a man whose actions matched his words, who had purchased her freedom only to return it, who taught her survival without expecting anything in return. She thought of the auctioneer's sneer, the men's laughter, the small nods that confirmed her worth in coin. And now, here in the quiet of the canyon, she realized something new. Freedom could be chosen. It could be given without strings. Her hands, once folded in cautious reserve, now rested openly on her knees. Why? She asked finally. Why help me? He looked out over the canyon, the horizon streaked with the early morning sun. Because I know what it is to have people decide your worth. To have others claim what is not theirs to take. You deserve your own path. Her chest tightened, and a small smile broke through the tension she had carried for so long. It was not arrogance, not triumph. It was the quiet acknowledgement that, for the first time in months, perhaps years, she could breathe without expecting a hand to grab her lungs. The lesson was deeper than survival skills, or reading tracks in the dust. It was a lesson in trust and agency. The frontier had shown her cruelty, injustice, and exploitation, but here, she learned a rare truth. Human decency could exist even in the harshest places. That night, she lay under the stars, the fire flickering low beside her. The wind whispered across the canyon, carrying with it scents of sage and distant rain. She thought of the town she had left behind, the hands that had tried to claim her, the coins that had tried to measure her worth, and she thought of the Apache, who had seen her not as a possession but as a person, and who had quietly offered her the freedom to choose her own fate. For the first time, the weight on her shoulders began to lift. It was not just survival she sought anymore. It was possibility, and in that quiet, under a sky stretching endlessly in every direction, she felt the first spark of something stronger than fear. Hope. The quiet they had found in the canyon could not last. Out here, freedom was fragile, and the frontier had a way of reminding travelers that danger often traveled faster than the wind. Few days after leaving the town, while following a faint trail of game tracks toward a distant creek, the Apache paused abruptly. His hand rose, palm open, signaling her to stop. The desert stretched around them, empty at first glance, but he could feel the presence before she could. Small impressions in the sand, broken branches off the trail, signs that others had moved through this land recently. Not wildlife, humans, hunters, he said, his voice calm but low. She stiffened, instinctively stepping closer, not behind him, but beside him. Fear flared, but it was different now. She wasn't cowering. She was alert, ready to act. The lessons of the desert, the water sources, the fire, and the herbs had taught her more than survival. They had taught her awareness. They think you belong to them? She asked, almost a whisper. They believe unpaid debts are ownership, he replied. They are wrong. It was true. Bounty hunters and men with grudges had spread word after the auction. Some claimed she was still bound by the town's claim, an asset that had slipped through their grasp. Others sought revenge, seeing the Apache as the one who interfered with business. The frontier had rules, but the men enforcing them often ignored law and morality alike. He crouched, scanning the horizon. We cannot outrun them. Must outsmart. Her pulse raced, but she remembered the herbs she had carried. She had learned to recognize the smoke patterns of a campfire and the way scent traveled across dry washes. She also remembered the traps used in her husband's work camps, simple tools, clever in execution. I can help, she said, her voice steady. Use smoke from sage. Mislead them. They follow scent, not eyes. He glanced at her, a hint of a smile brushing his lips. Respect had grown between them, from teacher and student to partners in survival. Good, he said. Together they prepared. She crushed dried sage and tucked it into a bundle, small enough to carry and light quickly. He picked stones and branches to shape a narrow diversion, making it look like a trail of passage. When the hunters appeared on a ridge the next morning, the smoke drifted away from their real path, misleading the pursuers into thinking they had gone east. While the duo slipped quietly west. It was her quick thinking that saved them. She moved with a confidence that would have been impossible weeks earlier. No longer the timid woman begging for safety, but a capable partner in the desert. The Apache's admiration for her grew, not in possession, not in gratitude, but in recognition of her courage. When the hunters finally realized the ruse, they turned back toward the town, muttering threats. But the Apache and the widow were gone, already miles ahead. The desert swallowed their tracks, leaving nothing behind but the shifting wind and the small footprints of two people who had learned to survive together. That night, as they rested near a hidden spring, she spoke quietly. "I am not afraid now, like before." He nodded, tossing a small stone into the water. "Fear is natural, but courage is choice. You chose courage." She smiled faintly, watching her reflection ripple in the spring. For the first time, she understood the truth of her own words. She had begged him to do it in town, expecting ownership or control. Instead, he had given her lessons, trust, and partnership, and now, in the face of real danger, she realized she had become more than someone who needed saving. She had become someone capable of standing her ground. The frontier had not softened. The desert, the hunters, the lawless lands were still merciless. But for the first time, she felt equal to it. Not just surviving, but thriving in the knowledge that freedom and courage were hers to claim. The Apache glanced at her and nodded once. No words were needed. They were no longer master and rescued. They were two outsiders walking a dangerous land, united by respect, skill, and the growing bond of trust. And for the first time in her life, she believed that maybe, just maybe, the frontier could offer more than hardship. It could offer a future. The Apache and the widow had settled into a fragile rhythm, moving by day, hiding by night, surviving on instincts and lessons learned from each other. But the frontier had a way of testing not just endurance, but ingenuity, and it was about to test hers. One late afternoon, as they crossed a narrow canyon flanked by jagged cliffs, the distant sound of hooves and shouting reached their ears. The hunters had regrouped, more determined than ever. This time, they were closer, and the terrain made escape difficult. The widow's heart raced, but fear no longer paralyzed her. She had learned to act. "They will trap us," she said, her voice firm, pointing to a narrow section of the canyon where the walls almost touched. "We can't outrun, but we can mislead." The Apache studied the canyon. "You have plan?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, smoke, rocks, noise. They follow patterns, not senses. I learned in camp. Railroad workers. We tricked guards, made false paths." The plan was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. They gathered dry brush and sage, hidden under rocks and cracks. She crushed the herbs, creating a small, pungent smoke that could carry for a distance, signaling a trail that did not exist. The Apache prepared small stones balanced to tumble down slopes at key moments, creating the illusion of movement. As the hunters entered the canyon, shouting and scanning for tracks, she lit the sage. A thin curling plume rose into the air, drifting along a false path toward the cliffs. When the hunters followed it, thinking the pair had gone that way, the Apache and the widow slipped quietly through a hidden crevice leading to the real trail, a path only he knew. Her hands moved deftly, her movements precise. Every action, lighting the fire, positioning the stones, setting the smoke, required coordination and timing. Yet she performed it with the confidence that came from knowledge. Knowledge born of hardship, observation, and now partnership. The hunters, misled by the scent and visual cues, scrambled after phantom tracks. By sunset, their shouts faded into the distance. The canyon returned to its natural silence, broken only by the whisper of wind over stone. The Apache looked at her, eyes reflecting both relief and admiration. "Quick thinking," he said simply. She exhaled, a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. I am not just someone to save," she said. "I can help. I can protect myself. Help you." For the first time, he saw her not as a person in need of rescue, but as a capable partner, equal in courage and resourcefulness. Her skills, once dismissed by the townsfolk as the labor of a widow or immigrant, had now become essential for survival. That night, they camped beneath a lone mesquite tree. The stars stretched across the sky, cold and brilliant. The widow prepared a simple tea from her herbs, sharing it with the Apache. He accepted it, and together they sat in silence, letting the quiet of the desert speak. "Your courage," he said finally, "is not like town fear. It is choice. It is strength." She nodded, feeling the truth of his words. In towns, courage was often forced, a mask to survive exploitation. Here, courage was deliberate, born from understanding the land, the danger, and the limits of their own bodies. It was a shared courage, a bond forged between two outsiders in a land that respected no one but the prepared and the alert. As the fire dimmed, she realized how far she had come. From the auction block, trembling in fear, to a woman capable of outsmarting hunters in a canyon, she had transformed. Not because someone had saved her, but because she had chosen to learn, to act, and to trust herself. The frontier had tested her, and she had passed.
After weeks on the trail, the Apache and the widow finally reached a wide valley tucked between low hills and a slow-flowing creek. The land was open, fertile in patches, and far enough from the lawless towns to offer safety, yet close enough that travelers occasionally passed by. It was a rare place in the frontier, a chance to not just survive, but to build something lasting. He turned to her, the wind tugging at his hair. "We stay?" he asked, simple words heavy with choice. She looked at the valley, at the soft green of wild grasses, the glinting water, the open sky that promised freedom in every direction. For the first time since leaving her husband's camp, she felt the full weight of agency, the power to decide for herself. "I stay," she said firmly, "but not out of obligation, because I choose. Not because you saved me, not because anyone paid. I stay because I want to live my life." He nodded once, approvingly. That was all the acknowledgement they needed. They began making the valley their home. Together, they built a small shelter of logs and brush, simple but sturdy. She taught him how to store water in clay jars and preserve food using drying techniques. From her railroad camp days, he showed her how to track game, find medicinal herbs, and create signals to warn of approaching travelers or danger soon. Their home became more than a refuge. Travelers along the trade routes noticed the small shelter and the carefully tended spring. They came for water, guidance, or advice about safe paths through the desert. Word spread of the quiet Apache and the wise widow who offered help freely, without expectation. Their home became a place where outsiders could feel seen and protected, just as they themselves had learned to survive on the frontier. Over time, the widow began teaching young travelers simple herbal remedies and survival techniques, sharing knowledge that had once been her secret lifeline. The Apache continued to pass on his skills, reading the land, finding water, and reading danger in the smallest signs. Together, they blended traditions, creating a unique survival wisdom born from two very different worlds. One evening, as the sun set in shades of gold and crimson, the widow sat on the small porch of their shelter. The Apache joined her silently, handing her a cup of tea brewed from sage and peppermint. She watched the creek reflect the colors of the sky, and for the first time, She felt fully at peace. "You gave me more than freedom," she said softly, turning to him. "You gave me a choice, and I chose it to stay, to live." He smiled faintly, the lines of hardship on his face softening in the evening light. "You earned it," he replied. "Not me, you." It was a quiet acknowledgement, but powerful. The frontier had tested them both, through fear, pursuit, and survival, and now it offered something rare, not just safety, but belonging. Years passed. Their shelter grew into a modest homestead. Travelers came and went, but the Apache and the widow remained steadfast. Their home a symbol of resilience, cooperation, and respect across cultures. What had begun as an unlikely pairing, a Chinese widow freed from debt and a lone Apache outsider, had grown into a partnership rooted in mutual respect, shared wisdom, and quiet love. The desert, once a place of fear and danger, had become their sanctuary, and in that wide valley under endless sky, they discovered a truth as vast as the frontier itself: freedom, once earned, can grow into life, knowledge, and happiness, built not by money, but by trust, courage, and choice. Years had passed since the auction block in that dusty town, yet the valley, where the Apache and the widow had settled, remained untouched by greed or violence. The small shelter they had built together had grown into a modest homestead, a sturdy log cabin, a garden of herbs and vegetables, and a shaded area where travelers could rest their horses. Every stone, every jar of water, and every carefully planted seed carried the story of two outsiders who had chosen to trust and protect each other. The widow, once trembling on the auction platform, now moved with quiet confidence. She greeted travelers from distant towns, offering water, herbal remedies, and advice for crossing the unforgiving land. Her knowledge, once a private lifeline, became a gift to others. Children of passing families learned how to read the tracks of deer, identify safe plants, and respect the subtle signs of weather and wildlife. Through her, the wisdom of her people blended with the land and the lessons of the Apache, creating a shared knowledge that could endure beyond them. The Apache, still the silent guardian he had always been, continued to watch the horizon and teach about survival, tracking, and the rhythms of the land. Travelers often marveled at how he and the widow worked together, not as master and servant, not as protector and rescued, but as equals, two people bound by choice, courage, and mutual respect. One evening, as the sun sank low, painting the sky in molten gold and crimson, the widow sat on the porch of their cabin, cradling a cup of sage tea. The Apache joined her without a word, placing a gentle hand over hers. For a long moment, they simply watched the valley stretch out beneath the endless western sky. "You gave me freedom," she said softly, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had learned the value of choice. "But you also gave me something more. You taught me that freedom is only meaningful if you can stand on your own." He nodded, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "You earned it," he replied. "Not me, you." It was a truth that summed up their journey, the journey of survival, courage, and resilience. From the auction block to the hidden valley, she had grown from fear and uncertainty into strength and agency, and he had learned, in turn, that even a lone Apache could find partnership and trust in the unlikeliest of places. The creek babbled softly nearby, carrying the scent of sage and the faint echo of past storms. The wind whispered through the trees, stirring the leaves and dust like a gentle applause. Travelers would continue to come and go, carrying the stories of the wise widow and the steadfast Apache, spreading lessons of survival, respect, and shared humanity far beyond the valley. And in that quiet, hopeful moment, under the vast expanse of the western sky, the widow and the Apache understood something neither money nor fear could ever buy: that life could be rebuilt, trust could be earned, and happiness could be chosen, not because it was given, but because it was created, together, one step at a time. On the frontier they had made their own. The desert, once harsh and merciless, had become their sanctuary. The frontier, once a place of danger, had become a home, and their story of courage, choice, and quiet hope would live on in every traveler who crossed that valley, learning that freedom, respect, and love are treasures far greater than any coin,